Hey everyone, so welcome to today's lecture in Intro to International Relations, and today we're going to be looking at international political economy, or IPE for short. So we'll be looking at trade and finance side. I'm sorry about the WMD one from last time. The political psychology and public opinion stuff was very important and filled up a lot more time than anticipated, but it was kind of our last of our theory, so I wanted to give it the proper time for development. I will try to fit WMDs in next time. I'll shorten the international organizations part a little bit and put in a small section on WMDs there. International political economy itself is an enormous topic. You can have entire introductory level courses just on IPE. So at least in this one, I want to give it at least adequate coverage, and so kind of the full class.
All right, so when we're talking about international trade or just international political economy, particularly lately, we've been talking, or the last couple of decades, we've been talking a lot about the rise of globalization. As we see the spread of trade and everything else, globalization certainly become one of the buzzwords. And so globalization could be defined as the increasing integration of the world in terms of communication, culture, and economics. May also refer to the changing subjective experience of space and time that accompanies this process, right? So it's looking at how the world has become, smaller or more interconnected in terms of certainly economics, so increase of trade and spread of finance globally, right? You're not just doing trade or sending money to people, locally, you're doing it nationally and internationally. Culture, right? We have access to cultural products, not just from our own country, but from so many other countries. And communication. You can now have Skype or FaceTime with people all over the world. It used to, if you wanted to, communicate with somebody from across the world, you needed a pen pal and you sent them a letter, and it took, ages to get a response because the letter had to be sent across oceans, and it was really, really slow, and the person then had to write back and put it back in the mail, and then you get your response. I mean, now you can WhatsApp or Skype or FaceTime with people all across the world, and it's as if they were right beside you. In the time of lockdown with the coronavirus, it's just as easy to talk to somebody across the world as it is to talk to somebody in your own city almost. Another definition is the widening, deepening, and speeding up of worldwide interconnectedness in all aspects of contemporary social life. So it's wider, deeper, and faster. So we have deeper connections over widening, so a broader amount of different subject areas, and speeding up of worldwide. So everything's going faster. Again, like communication, it used to take weeks, if not months, to get responses. Now it's a matter of seconds or milliseconds that you can get a response. So it's just gone in travel, right? Like it used to be, if you wanted to travel to Europe, you had to take a boat across, and that was really slow. Then air travel increasingly came in, but that was, not something that everyone had access to. Now, more and more people around the world have access to international travel. You can travel to Europe and see, whatever country interests you, and then come home, and that's a viable summer vacation for a lot of people, where that wasn't the case in the past, or it would certainly take a lot more than a summer. So that's kind of the process of globalization that we've seen, we've seen definitely take hold over the last 2 decades, and definitely get deeper, faster, and wider. The integration of markets, finance, and technologies in a way that is shrinking the world from a size medium to a size small, and enabling each of us to reach around the world farther, faster, and cheaper than ever before. So I'm just pulling in different definitions from different scholars. They are all saying a lot of the same things, just in slightly different ways. So I want to kind of give you different kind of perspectives. I like that, from a size medium to a size small. and farther, faster, and cheaper than ever before, right? So reaching around across the world, right? So again, through communication technologies, travel technologies, we can go further, we can get there faster, and it's all cheaper than it ever was before. So communication technology cheaper, travel's cheaper, getting products from abroad is cheaper, and faster. So think of the ordering products from Amazon, which could be coming from just about anywhere. You can now get same day or 1 day shipping, which is amazing. And it's not just other e-commerce providers too. So globalization includes expanded international trade, expanded telecommunications, monetary coordination, multinational corporations, technical and scientific cooperation, cultural exchanges of new types and scales, migration and refugee flows, and relations between the world's rich and poor countries. So all these things kind of play into dynamics that are happening within globalization. So they're all different things that we need to be paying attention to when we're looking at globalization. Today, we're going to be focusing more on kind of the trade side, international trade. But all of these different things are things that are being affected through the spread of globalization. And so all of them are definitely things that you'll want to be paying attention to as you kind of watch the world. So how do our three different theories look at globalization? So our liberal, critical, mercantilist, and critical approaches, how do they all kind of view globalization? So the liberal view is integrating in world economy brings growth and prosperity, right? So similar to what we said, just on the trade side, as you open up the world economy and take down barriers and let businesses, do business with businesses, and individuals do business with other individuals, and there's, no blockading, you get greater global efficiency, you get greater global growth, and so you see gains for countries around the world, and people are more prosperous in general. States are losing importance to intergovernmental organizations, multinational corporations, and non-governmental organizations. So there's an element of this that people have talked about, the demise of states, that particularly multinational corporations are gaining in prominence. And I did show you on that first day kind of the comparing of I believe it was 100 largest economic entities in the world, and 73 or something like that of them were corporations, and only about 27 of them were states. So it's certainly shown that many multinational corporations, in terms of pure financial power, actually, are larger than many states. That said, we also don't want to overstate, right? Like the death of the state. States are still incredibly important, are still, it's hard to look at the world today and say that states aren't of critical importance in setting policy. Just look at something like COVID-19, and yes, it's showing the importance of globalization in terms of how quickly that spread. But also, if you're looking at the importance of states, it was states who largely, with the help of IGOs and NGOs, like IGOs like the World Health Organization, and multinational corporations in providing supplies, but it was states and local governments that are leading the effort. And so if you want to look at how the spread of the virus has operated in different countries, you also look at the policies within those countries, and you could certainly see that, well, the pandemic could get everywhere. How quickly or how much it spread to a certain extent was dependent on the actions of the government and how they managed it. So certainly, states are losing importance to these different actors, but it's not to say that they're gone. The North-South division, so between what we call the global North and the global South, and typically your richer and poorer countries, is less important, since the global South is moving in divergent directions depending on countries and regions' integration with world markets. So those global South countries that have integrated into the world market are doing quite well. So you're seeing, some countries are still getting stuck behind, but those that have really integrated into the world economy are actually doing quite well. So it's harder to talk about a kind of uniform global north and a uniform global south, particularly within the global south. You've seen, some real success stories from the liberal perspective, and you've seen certainly countries that have been a lot less successful. The critical theorist view. Globalization is a process with long historical origins, not a recent phenomenon, as economic liberals regularly suggest. And so there is a lot of truth to that while globalization may have accelerated and may be more apparent, that's not to say that we haven't had, increasing, kind of deeper, wider, and faster economic and cultural and technological exchange over centuries. It's so apparent now because of how fast things are, right? But if you think of from shipping, just even being able to sell across oceans, that was massive. So it's throughout human history that we've kind of been progressing towards a more globalized world, and it's not that recent a phenomenon. It may just have it is possible that it's not a linear process, and it, at certain points can accelerate or have a deeper impact. But we do want to look at it within kind of a more of a historical context from the critical theorist perspective. Economic inequality is increasing, including if we look at the North versus the South, but also within states. Right, and you could see that within many states, even in the global North, that if you look within the states, they take the United States, there's very, very pronounced increases in economic inequality. So the rich continue getting a lot more, and the poorest are staying relatively stagnant, and that's definitely true in many northern global North countries, even many of the richest, where you've seen relatively stagnating wages that barely keep pace with inflation in the global North. And if that means that if the entire economy is getting larger and middle class and lower classes aren't getting more, that means all of this increased wealth is typically going to your richest. And that's definitely true globally. So we're seeing increase between countries, particularly your richer and your haves and your have-nots. You're getting a larger spread between your haves and have-nots between countries, but also within countries, you're getting an increase inequality between your haves and your have-nots. If you look at the purchasing power of the middle class in, say, North America, it's much lower than it was decades ago. So continuing on globalization, critical theorist view on globalization, that it's when we talk about globalization or globalized civilization, it's really a civilization based on norms associated with the West, right? So rather than globalization, it may be more appropriate to talk about Westernization, because based on norms associated with the West and spread of neoliberal market ideology around the world. This increasing homogeneity is in part offset by small local moments of resistance in which people try to identify along the lines of language, religion, and other cultural factors. Right. So when we talk about globalization, in many ways, it's true that if we look at the spread of the norms, if we spread like an economic system, even many cultural products, right, it's spreading of Western products. Western economic systems, Western values, Western film, television, cultural products around the world. And that's not to say that the rest of the world doesn't send any of those things in or doesn't contribute at all. But when we're talking about the homogenizing of the world, as everyone's kind of gaining access to the same type of input or the same forces, those forces are disproportionately coming from the West. And that can provoke, so when we're looking at resistance in different parts of the world, that's one important thing to keep in mind, is that many of these resistance are pushbacks partially against globalization, but more about its Westernization, right? About wanting to keep local norms based on or local language, right? Because English is increasingly the global language, wanting to keep religious values and other cultural factors, not wanting to just be consuming Western values, products, language, religion, and culture. Okay, the mercantilist view on globalization. Mercantilists focus on the erosion of state sovereignty and diffusion of authority to more actors, including many non-state actors. So remember, if economics is supposed to serve the state and the state power, and if globalization is moving power away from the state, this is something that mercantilists are certainly going to be focusing on. Whether or not state power is strengthened or weakened by globalization remains to be seen. It may be that state power will be transformed to operate in new contexts with new tools. So it, also people say the death of the state. Let's see how the state responds. However, the concern from this perspective is that states will be eclipsed by new and more powerful global actors, either, some supranational type bodies in the IGO, so kind of trying to go world government a la UN, but more likely regional type ones of EU style, which from a just purely state power perspective involves giving up of some state power to a supranational body. So certain, for example, regulations or policies in the EU are set EU-wide, not country-wide, and domestic governments are forced to implement those policies, but also kind of the loss of power to other actors like multinational corporations. And this would certainly be a concern from a mercantilist perspective. All right, let's look a little bit deeper at trade. Now that we've kind of talked a little bit about globalization and our different theories, let's dive a little bit deeper into trade itself. So about 1/6 of total economic activity in the world is trade. So that's quite a lot of economic activity. It accounts for about 19 trillion worth of trade each year. So that's a massive sum, many times the size of the Canadian economy. And it's 12 times larger than the global military spending. So when we talk so much about, military spending and military security and defense and all that stuff, if we're talking about in terms of spending and economic activity, trade is actually a much larger force in terms of its at least magnitude of spending. Here's world merchandise and trade and commercial services from 2005 to 2015, pulled from the World Trade Organization. And so you could see that trade, so we did have the blip of, this should be around 2008, 2009, where we saw, the collapse in the world economy with the world financial crisis. So we see the blip around here, but generally we see trade, so the magnitudes, and it tends to be going up. And same thing in trade and services, much lower than trade in goods. And there is some variation always, like we see a small downturn here, but in general, we see a trend upwards in terms of both, and very, very high volumes. Economies by size of merchandise trade in 2015. So billions of US dollars. So the darker the color, the larger the magnitude of trade in terms of billions of dollars. So we see kind of the US, China, Japan, some of the Western European countries, the UK, France, Germany, leading the world in terms of at least volumes of, or at least volumes in terms of currency. So, and then you've got kind of your second tier of Canada, Mexico, Russia, many of the other Western European countries, and then India. And then going further down, depending, Brazil, Australia, not many actually in that category. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, in that category. So you could notice most of the largest economies are in what we'd call the global north, and the lowest amounts of trade are definitely in these regions. 52%. So merchandise trade, merchandise exports of WTO members totaled 16.2 trillion in 2015. 52%. The top 10 merchandise traders accounted for 52% of the world's total trade in 2015. So half of world trade was kind of conducted by only 10 countries. So out of 190, say, countries, 10 of them accounted for half of it. And developing economies had only 42% share in world merchandise trade in 2015. And given that developing economies account for a massive share of the world population, so it still is showing that, you know, some level of inequality. Trade is certainly more prevalent and probably helping your richer countries more. That's not to say that trade isn't important in less developed countries. This is showing total volume, right? But it also makes sense that larger economies will have more trade and smaller economies will have less trade because larger economies can produce more and can also buy more. So that makes some sense. So I don't want those slides to make you think that trade is unimportant in less developed countries. The level of development isn't necessarily correlated with how important trade is. So volumes of trade are larger in industrialized countries. Trade plays as important of a role in less developed countries. We'll take a look here. So world development, so this is from World Development Indicators from, this must, I think, from World Bank. I got this. This is trade as a percentage of GDP. And so the lighter you get, the more important trade is to as a percentage of your GDP. So the darkest is from 22 to 48% of your GDP, and then it keeps going up. So trade as a percentage of your GDP. And you can see, say, you know, countries like the US and China, which are your two largest traders in terms of volume, are in the lowest category for what it makes up of in terms of their economies, because they have such massively large internal economies that, yes, they do a massive amounts of trade, but they also do a massive, they've, you know, the US has got 300 something million, more than 1 billion in China. So they have massive internal markets. So yes, they do a lot, huge volumes of international trade, but also huge volumes of internal trade. Whereas many other countries, so if we take, you know, Canada, Canada's got a much smaller internal market, only 36 million people. So trade plays a much larger or more important role in the Canadian economy, particularly trade in our case with the US. We see that in much of Western Europe, or much of Europe in general. There's very few that are in the kind of your darkest category. And if you look kind of globally, whereas, you know, this map, you could see very clear kind of geographic in terms of volume, north-south, and you could definitely see certain regions, for example, had higher volumes than other regions. Here you don't see nearly as much of a regional pattern, particularly look at a continent like Africa. So some you don't have data, but you go from all the way to the lowest category to the highest category and pretty much everything in between. Europe too, you go from the lowest to the highest category and pretty much everything in between. So development doesn't necessarily, high development or low development doesn't necessarily mean that trade is more or less important to you based on the size of your economy. Let's look at some trade trends. So what trends can we see when we look at patterns in trade? So certainly global integration. And so that kind of fits with our globalization we talked about with globalization. We see integration of industrialized regions with each other in a truly global market. The World Trade Organization is especially important. So World Trade Organization members and how much they trade with each other. And we have seen massive increases in trade globally across the world, falling in trade barriers through different WTO negotiations. So now trade barriers keep coming down. And so it's easier to trade with almost any country in the world. So we're definitely seeing global integration, that if you go into the store and you look at where is a product from, it could be from almost anywhere, from almost any region, depending on kind of the volume of trade. Some regions are going to be or some countries are going to be more likely to find, but we really see a global integration. But at the same time, we see a global integration, we also see a regional integration. So emerging potential division of the industrialized West into three competing trading blocks, each internally integrated, but not very open to the other two blocks. Regional free trade areas in Europe and North America, and perhaps in Asia in the future, raise the possibility of trading zones practicing liberalism inwardly and mercantilism outwardly. So at the same time that we're seeing kind of a globalization in falling of kind of global barriers to trade, we're also seeing patterns of regional integration, where within a region, barriers are almost completely eliminated, or limited even more, and they're putting up a common barrier against external states, at least in the European case. But at least in all of the trade blocks, you see more or larger falling barriers within regions. So particularly within Europe and North America, but you're seeing some elements of it in Asia as well. And then you see some other regional ones of like Asia Pacific, which may include Canada or the US, or Australia, or Pacific countries in South America, into different regions. And they have decreased barriers. But this kind of competing, every time you've got regional integration, unless I could expand into global integration, you see a tension of, are we going to go where just barriers globally fall, or are we going to go into competing blocks? Europe competes with, it's got like almost like super Europe economy competing against super North America economy, competing against super Asia economy, where they've got low barriers inwardly. So particularly within Europe, no boundaries inwardly. So trade is completely free. We're open within European Union, but will the European Union start putting up tougher and tougher barriers to people who are outside of the EU? And you see some element of looking like with these formation of blocks that could happen. So why does trade work? Why does trade help make people better, or better off, help increase global gains? So gains from trade are possible due to the comparative advantage states enjoy in producing certain goods. So not every state is as good at producing everything. So there's some things that, for example, Canada is really good at producing, and some things Canada is really not good at producing. Some things Canada can't produce. And so the idea of comparative advantage would be, so if we take the things Canada's, if you don't have free trade and you take the things Canada's not good at producing, right? Canadians, if they're having to buy it produced by domestic producers, they're going to be paying really high costs because Canada's not good at producing it, or will be buying really low quality because Canada's not good at producing it. But if you're able to bring in products from outside, from countries that can produce it much better, much higher quality, cheaper cost, then Canadians do better because they get better products, lower cost. And then if Canada exports the areas where Canada has an advantage, produces really well, then Canada makes a lot of money off of selling it because we've got an advantage. Other people want our product, but also those who buy it, right? They do better off. They're not wasting as much money on buying the product locally. They're saving a bunch of money by buying it internationally. So how do we figure out who's got comparative advantage in what areas? We look at the factors of production for that. And factors of production are basic inputs to production. And we tend to look at it in terms of land, labor, and capital. So land being the territory and kind of the resources on it that you need. Labor is your workers, and capital is the money or the tech or factories that are needed to produce something. And each different good that you sell requires certain different inputs, right? Some take a lot of labor to produce, but don't take much capital and don't take much land. Some, like something like, say, farming takes a lot of land, or a lot of natural resource type things require a lot of land. If you want to be doing timber, well, you need to have really big forests to get the timber from. If you want to do mining, well, you need a whole bunch of different mines, and that requires land with different resources in it. And so each country is going to have, so each good requires different factors of production. And each country has relative abundance of each factor, and they differ in this relative abundance. So some will do really well in one factor and really poorly in another factor. So some countries like Canada and Russia have large territories and natural resources. So if we look at a comparative advantage in terms of any good that requires a lot of land, well, Canada and Russia are doing really well there. But Canada, certainly, and also to a certain extent, Russia, goods that require a lot of labor. Canada certainly, 36 million is not a small country if we compare it to countries around the world. It's also not a big country. And so in terms of labor, Canada doesn't have a relative abundance. We have a relative shortage of labor. So other countries such as China and India have large populations, right? So relative to others, they have a cheap supply of labor compared to others, where Canada, compared to other countries, has a cheap supply or relative abundance of land. So each nation's comparative advantage is traced to its particular endowments, so how much it has of different factors of production, that is basic inputs such as land, labor, and capital that are used in different proportions in the production of different goods and services. Since the cost of these inputs in each country will depend on the availability, difference in factors of endowments across countries will create differences in comparative advantage. Each country will tend to export items whose production requires intensive use of the factors with which it is abundantly endowed relative to other nations, right? So the cost of different inputs depends on its availability. So if you've got a lot of a particular resource, then it's not very expensive to use. So for example, using land in Canada, well, because there's an abundance of land, getting land isn't particularly expensive. Think of a much smaller country that has very little land and say a large population on that land. Getting land is extremely costly. So if you want to be producing a good that takes land, acquiring that land is very, very costly in some countries. And in a country like Canada, it's very, very cheap. Same thing for something like labor. In a country like Canada with a relatively low population, getting the best talent can be very, very costly because there's not a huge amount of workers. Or if you need a lot of workers, because you're competing with different industries for a relatively small population, then it could be quite costly. Where if you're dealing with a massive country with a huge population, it's less costly to be able to get the different wage earners that you need, or the different laborers that you need. And so countries will export or tend to produce the goods where they have an advantage. So you'd say, for example, Canada should tend to produce goods that require a lot of land, a lot of resource type based things or agricultural based things. Because we've got a lot of land, we can produce those goods cheaper than a country that has really expensive land. And so we can earn a lot of money. We can produce it cheaply and then sell it at a lower price than international competitors. People in other countries will want to buy it. And so we can make a lot of money because other people globally, we're not just selling our agricultural product anymore to Canadians, you're selling it to people, around the world. We're selling the natural resources to people around the world, and those people want to buy it because we can produce it cheaper than they can. Similar logic again, going back to land, is that, going back to labor, is, a lot of labor-intensive products we buy from more populous countries because they can produce the products cheaper than we can. If you look at the wages it would take to pay people to produce it in Canada, it's much higher. And part of that is tied to the size of the population or the abundance of the factor. Balance of trade. So when we look at trade and patterns of trade across countries, we look at the balance of trade, which is the values of a state's exports relative to its imports. So you take the exports and subtract the imports and find the balance of trade. If you have a positive balance of trade, that's a country that exports more than it imports. So it has a trade surplus. It makes more money from trade. So it sells a lot and gets back a lot of money. It only spends some of that money on imports. So at the end of the day, it comes out richer uh, from trade. Negative balance of trade, a country that imports more than it exports. Now, there's a lot of discussion in politics about, which is better. Many countries, particularly in the Donald Trump presidency, talks about how the U.S. loses in trade. It's a lot more complicated than we just, want trade surpluses, want to avoid trade deficits. Yes, trade deficits have certain costs, right? But importing, exporting is great because it brings in money to you. Importing is also great from kind of a comparative advantage perspective because importing means that you're getting products cheaper than you could have at home, right? If you're not if you put limits on importing, or if you say, hey, importing is terrible, well, then you're buying often, more expensive local products. So from a consumer's perspective, importing is actually really good because then we get a better selection of products. We can choose, from a larger selection and find one that we really like, and the price will be lower. But at the end of the day, you also have to pay some attention to the balance of trade, because if you have a negative balance of trade, you're paying for that trade deficit in some way. So the balance of trade must ultimately be reconciled, right? So if you have a surplus or if you have a deficit, right, you have to some way or other get back to zero. Because you can't have more money flowing into your country. Somehow, for example, if you've got excess, if you have a trade surplus, right, and you've got extra money from another country's currency, well, you've got to somehow spend that in some way. So it's tracked financially through a system of national accounts. In the short term, a state can trade for a few years at a deficit, followed by a few years at a surplus. Sometimes it is quite a long period at a deficit. The imbalances are carried on the national accounts as a kind of loan, right? So other countries are kind of just holding your currency, and we're willing to accept just holding excess currency. However, a trade deficit that persists for years becomes a problem because people are going to want to be spending this surplus money. This is an oversimplification, but a state with a chronic trade deficit must export part of its standing wealth, real estate companies, bank accounts, etc., by giving ownership of such wealth to foreigners. So what are people going to do if they've got an excess of your currency from trade surpluses? Well, what are they going to do is they're going to buy wealth in your country. So if I've got excess US dollars, what am I going to do from trade? Well, I might buy something in the US with those US dollars. And this might be real estate companies, bank accounts, or whatever, but you're giving some of your nation's wealth to someone else. Interdependence is a concept that we've talked about before, but it's certainly important as it relates to trade. So interdependence, again, is a political or economic situation in which two or more states are simultaneously dependent on one another for their well-being. Degrees of interdependence are sometimes designated as sensitivity or vulnerability. Remember that if you think about interdependence, free trade certainly creates a system where countries are interdependent on each other. If we move into a global market where you're producing the goods where you have a comparative advantage, importing the goods where you have a comparative disadvantage, right? You're relying on those other countries, A, to continue buying your goods, because if they stop buying it, you're going to be producing way too much of that good where you have a comparative advantage, but also you're just not producing a whole bunch of things that you need because you were able to buy it. And so if you get disruptions to global trade, you can then have massive disruptions to global supply chain of things you need. So for example, say you're buying medications from another country. So this is a salient one for right now. Say you're buying a whole bunch of medical equipment or medications from another country, and because of some crisis like a pandemic, countries either are unable to produce those goods because of illness or are unwilling to export it because of fear that they're going to have a shortage, then that's disrupted. You can't overnight start up a new supply of medical equipment or a new supply of drugs. It takes some time to implement, and so you could be facing a shortage. And so there is always something, interdependence has, some goods, but it also introduces certain risks. So sensitivity is the short-term dislocation caused by disrupting exchanges with another country. Is a sensitivity of supply. Over the long term, states may be able to change their policies to take advantage of alternatives that could substitute for disrupted trade. And vulnerability is a state that cannot adjust its policies to cope with disrupted trade, even over the long run, suffers from vulnerability of the supply. Right. So you're sensitive to trade if there's a disruption in trade, but over time you're able to, and so you may have a short-term disruption in your supply chain. So but over time, you'd be able to find alternatives. So take again medication, right? In the short term, if the countries that produce medicines that we import, if they stopped selling to Canada, we'd have a short-term disruption in our supply chain, and that could be very problematic in itself, right? But over time, Canada would have the know-how to set up and produce all of these different medications. And so we could, over the long term, find alternatives either with a different trading partner or just with our own domestic industry and replace those medical equipment or those medications. And so we're sensitive to disruptions in that type of trade, but it's something that we can adapt to. Vulnerability is when not only are you sensitive to short-term disruptions, but you're unable to adapt. And that means you're vulnerable to a change. So for example, it might be that you'd be vulnerable if to certain resources, right? If there's no substitute for a particular resource and you don't have any of that resource and the people who have it stop selling it to you, then you're vulnerable to that disruption because you don't have. And many have talked about oil as one of those. While we're working on alternative technologies and green technologies and all different replacement for oil, oil still plays a key part in so much of our economy. And so if you're a country that has no oil or doesn't produce oil or doesn't produce nearly enough of it, and even in the medium to long term, you could be working on alternatives, but if it's going to take a really, really, really long time, then you're vulnerable to disruptions in that supply. Trade states become mutually dependent on each other's political cooperation in order to gain relative economic gains. In international political economy, interdependence refers less to a bilateral mutual dependence than to a multilateral dependence, in which each state depends on the political cooperation of most or all of the others to keep world markets operating efficiently. Most states depend on the world market and not on specific trading partners. So often when we're talking security, we're talking kind of like two states or a few states may be dependent on each other. In trade, we're really talking about a global market. For most states, right? There's very few products that are only controlled by one state. So usually, even if one state would cut its ties with you, you weren't just dependent on them. You could get supply from someone else, or you could get that supply through someone else, even if they, bought it from state A that kind of cut off ties with you. So it's really more you're looking at kind of all different countries. You're interdependent on all or at least most countries continuing to participate in this system and making sure that the supply chains stay open, that there's no disruptions to the ability to get products to where they're going, that everybody's cooperating in the maintenance of the system. Most states depend more on the world market and not a specific trading partner. Now there are certain counterexamples where it's taking Canada, for example. Canada is obviously dependent on the world market, and we sell to many, many different countries, and we also import from many countries. Again, if you go into a store and you look at the labels of where things are produced, they're produced in so many different places. But also, though, if you look at Canada's kind of like trade statistics, a vast majority of our trade is with the United States. So to a certain extent, we're, yes, interdependent on or dependent on a global system of trade. But we're also really dependent on the United States because, yes, over probably the long term, if the US decides we're not going to trade with Canada, we could probably replace all of our exports over time and all of our imports and get them from somewhere else. It would take quite a lot of time because it takes so long just because we'd be replacing probably like 80% of our trade. So we need to find buyers for not just some of our exports, for the vast majority of our exports. We'd have to be finding imports, not just for some of our imports, but for most of our imports. So there certainly are certain situations where states still are dependent on a specific trading partner as well. So what are different strategies you can use for trading? So given that we see, trade is a fact of the world, states need different strategies for trying to manage how they can approach it. So the one that you see the least frequently is called autarky, which really means self-reliance. And it's a policy of avoiding or minimizing trade and trying to produce everything one needs, the most vital things by oneself. Pretty much nobody does it. Even North Korea has trade with, say, China to a certain extent. So this isn't really a strategy that anyone's adopting. Some want to, minimize trade to a certain extent, or produce as much as they can at home, but nobody goes kind of the full autarky route of being self-reliant. Trade definitely has won out as a kind of global norm, in the sense that even if not everybody likes it, not everybody participates in the same way, even if there's different strategies and some cheat and there's debates about how good trade is. Everybody at least participates to a certain extent in the international in international trade. Second is protectionism, and even in free trade systems, everybody to a certain extent, even all those countries that say we're big in free trade and we want open markets, every country in the world to a certain extent exhibits some levels of protectionism. And in particular, in some of the cases we're going to talk about. So the protection of domestic industries against international competition by trade, tariffs, or other means, right? So every time that you're trying to protect your industries against different importers, you're engaging in protectionism. So a lot of countries will say, we really, really like international trade and we don't want any barriers on our export. Oh, but we need to protect this domestic industry. So they don't want anybody else putting up barriers, but they want to put up barriers of their own. And so this is really, really common to protect some domestic industry. And at certain times, it's actually, even if you're a supporter of free trade, can be justified. So what are motivations? When do you see this most frequently? First is protection of infant industries. So if your country is developing a new industry, so say you're just starting out and developing a new airline industry or a new technology or new manufacturing in a certain industry, at the beginning when you're developing a new industry in your country, you're not going to be competitive with people who have been doing it for a really long time. So the idea of protectionism is to, give your infant industry, a little bit of time where they're protected from competition while they're not competitive. To do this smart, though, you can't protect them so much that they don't develop, right? If you protect them so much and if they feel like they're going to get protected forever, they may never become competitive. And so it may either have to be something that you protect them forever, or that once you take off the protection, they end up failing. And so what was the point? So if this is to be done and done smartly, it should be done in a way that you're pushing still the company or the industry towards being competitive. Breathing room when market conditions shift or new competition emerges. Sometimes just something in the market changes, a massive new player emerges, or There's some disruption in the market, and the local industries in your country, they just need a little bit of time to recuperate, to adjust to the new economic reality. So protectionism may be put in to just to give them a little bit of time to emerge or to kind of adjust. Protect national security. So there's some industries that, for example, are related to production of weaponry, or that are important in production of weaponry, that states like to protect because they don't want to rely on other countries, particularly great powers don't want to rely on other countries for their national security hardware, so for their key weapon systems and stuff like that. And so they want to make sure that they've got the, within their own country, they have strong industries that can produce those technologies or can produce those materials, so the raw materials or the technology is used to assemble them. So they might want to protect and have a domestic aerospace industry. They might want to have a domestic steel industry, and they want to protect these from competition because they don't want them to collapse, because they need them for producing things that are of key importance. And they're worried that if you say, even if you've got all the technology for war, but you need steel to build it and you don't have a domestic steel industry, if the people who do have domestic steel industries end up sometime in the future becoming an enemy, then they can choke you off from what you need to protect your weapon or produce your weaponry. Protected cultural diversity. So this is very common, and this is actually one that most people would admit to there being some justification for, is protect your cultural diversity. So think of, in Canada, on the radio and on television, Canadian networks or stations have Canada content rules. And that's to make sure that, our television isn't just showing American TV. For example, American television shows can, because of the nature of their market, a larger market with more money, they can produce, I don't want to say higher quality, but often they, for example, particularly in English language TV, American TV productions have much larger budgets than Canadian TV budgets. This is less true in the French-Canadian cultural market for reasons that we don't really need to get into. And so, if budget doesn't correlate perfectly with quality, but there are certain budget presents certain advantages. So if you told Canadians, do you want to watch these high budget American TV shows or movies, or do you want to watch these low budget Canadian ones? Most people, or a lot of people, too many people, from the perspective of the survival of the Canadian industry, would choose just the American ones. So if we believe that, we shouldn't just be watching American productions, that not only because we want to be supporting Canadian, workers, but also because Canadian productions also include elements of Canadian culture, and we don't want to just be getting culture from the United States. Nothing against American culture, but it's not exactly ours, and so we want to still have shows that reflect the Canadian way of life. And the only way to do that is to a certain extent protect the Canadian industry. So in that case, it's not, some is government grants to production, but some of it is Canada content rules, where a certain percentage of time has to go to Canadian content. Now, oftentimes that ends up getting, it's not necessarily that they put in Canadian content of, comedies or dramas. It ends up being Canadian content of news programming and sports. But at least it's something to guarantee that there's some level of Canada. And defensive efforts to ward off predatory practices by foreign companies or states. So again, this is another one that I think a lot of people would support as being justifiable. The last two probably being the ones that would most widely be viewed as justifiable. And this last one is essentially saying, if a company or another country, but a company outside of your country or just another country in general is cheating, well, the only reason that their firm might be products might be being your firm products is because that other company from the other state is getting an unfair advantage. And so, the government may put in protectionism or help its state or limit the availability of other products that come into its country to kind of compensate for the fact that it's cheating. Now, unfortunately, sometimes this becomes that you end up getting long debates in court cases over what constitutes cheating. And there's even some a little bit of cheating into accusations of cheating sometimes. But if you do see a state, and this is something that's built into the WTO, if another state is found to be cheating, to be giving unfair advantages to its companies, those who brought the charge against it are allowed to put in kind of countervailing measures. So either to impose punitive strategies against that other company, or to in somehow way help its own company. Methods. So how do you go about protectionism? So a tariff is one of the common ones. So that's a duty or tax levied on certain types of imports, usually as a percentage of their value, say, to a country. So if you've ever bought something from abroad and you see that there's this extra tax or the duty, or you went shopping in the United States and when you're crossing, they asked how much did you spend, and if it's above a certain amount, they put on this tax plus a tariff. And so this is a way of trying to make shopping in another country more expensive. It's an additional tax. So even if, say, they buying the good, so forget about exchange rates, even if buying the good in the other country was the same price or cheaper than buying in Canada, by adding this extra tax, it may make it more expensive. And so people might be less likely to do it. Non-tariff barriers. So these are forms of restricting imports other than tariffs. So they're barriers to trade that don't involve taxing. And they might include things like quotas. So you're only allowed, say, bringing in X number of iPhones into Canada. And so any more than that, you'd have to buy from a Canadian cell phone producer, Blackberries, say. So ceiling on how many goods of a certain kind can be imported. So anytime you've got a quota, that's not technically a tax, but it still is a limitation. Your company, domestic company, may lose out on the first X number until that quota is reached, but then after that, people can't buy that product. Subsidies. So that's when the government gives money to the domestic industry. So rather than making the other one more expensive, it helps to make the domestic export or the domestic product cheaper by putting in money to help in the development. And then restrictions and regulations. So this is one that's very hotly debated, are restrictions and regulations, because they can be used as trade barriers, but sometimes they're clearly put there. Japan at times has been particularly notorious on putting on safety regulations that make no sense and just are absolutely clearly meant as trade barriers. But then there's other times where a country says that it should have the right to set certain environmental or health or safety standards on products that will be consumed by its people, right? So, for example, if you want to sell a car in Canada and Canada cares about environmental standards, or if Canada cares about environmental standards, then it may say that the car needs a certain, fuel efficiency, right? It can't be too polluting of a car. And oftentimes that will be, that's probably often in that particular case not meant as a barrier to trade. The goal isn't to restrict trade. It's something that's been put on producers from wherever it comes, including domestic producers. And the goal of the regulation is helping environment. So it's fitting with the goal of the government. And so that's not really a trade barrier. That it can be a barrier to trade, but it's not what it's not protectionism. It's not intended in that sense. Where you sometimes end up getting into debates is that governments can use that. For example, say Canada, again, looking at, say, the environmental standard, knew that only Canadian car companies could afford, or North American, because it's so integrated, only North American car companies could afford to meet these standards. Other producers couldn't afford to meet these standards, either because it would involve costly research or making two different variants, one at a higher, or they just don't have the technology, whatever it might be. if you know that if the reason you're putting the restriction is because you say it's in the name of the environment, but it's really so that you know that only your companies can meet those regulations, then that's not because you necessarily care about the environment or health standards or safety. That's because you're trying to protect your industries. You're trying to make it so that other companies can't trade. And that then would become a trade barrier. And that would be something that the WTO would look at and say, no, that's problematic. But where that this one in particular, the restrictions and regulations can become difficult is especially when you're dealing with things like environmental or health or stuff like that standards, um, it can be very hard to figure out which ones are genuine, we care about this health or safety or environmental standard, and which ones are, oh, well, this is actually just put there in terms of being a really effective trade barrier. Debates over trade. So we've kind of talked quite a bit already about that some people like trade and some people don't. And the heart of the debates over trade come from while there's gains from trade for all countries in the aggregate. So everybody does better in general from trade. And so the size of the pie does increase. What makes trade so controversial is that among individuals within each country, trade creates winners and losers. So some people gain more than others. And not only do some people gain more than others, some people actually do lose, right? Like when you go to comparative advantage, when you go to free trade, some industries are going to lose, some workers are going to lose their job, some companies are going to fold, some are going to do fantastic because they're able to export so much more. But those particularly that are competing with imports, are sometimes going to struggle. And so people who are associated with those could lose their job, could lose, or at least, get decreases in wages. Some people get laid off. Companies will make less. So there's different models that have been produced that look at preferences on trade and can we figure out who's going to be a supporter of free trade and who's not going to be a supporter of free trade. And there's a couple of models I want to look at. So the Stolper-Samuelson theorem looks at factor production as influencing preferences on trade. And it argues that by encouraging specialization in each economy in export-oriented types of production, trade increases the demand for locally abundant factors while reducing demand for locally scarce factors. So according to this, according to the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, right, because trade becomes organized around factors of production, based on comparative advantage. So Canada would specialize or would do really well export type industries that rely on its abundant factors of production and would start specializing it. So in Canada's case, land, say, but so that would mean that people who own land or who are associated with industries involved with land, so the owners of land would do really well. Say the people owners of other factors, particularly say in the Canada's case, the non-abundant factors, so say labor, we're all of a sudden going to be competing with industries. So laborers in Canada are all of a sudden going to be competing with laborers in countries where labor is a much more abundant factor, and so it's much cheaper. So owners of land in Canada from free trade, right, because that's going to be, there'll be a specialization, they're going to do really well in exporting. People who own that factor, right, so landowners are going to love free trade. People who own, say, labor, and by labor I mean own labor, so workers, they're going to like, they're probably because they're going to lose out in Canada. This will be different in different countries depending. So laborers may not like it as much. Now, if you're a laborer in a country where that's an abundant factor of production, all of a sudden there's more demand for your work. There may be more earnings that could be coming in. So you may like free trade. If your country, say, that a very tiny country, so if you're a farmer in a tiny country where land is really expensive, and so where say agricultural products are more expensive to create, then you're probably not going to like um, free trade. So it depends on what factor. Are you a landowner? Are you a owner of labor, so a worker, or are you owner of capital, so of wealth to invest, or owner of a factory? How much you like trade is going to depend on kind of the relative abundance of these different factors in your country, and which ones are you going to specialize in? How are you going to do in trade based on the demand for your locally abundant factor? The second model, the specific factors model, focuses not on the factor of production, but on the industry. And the reason being that the real incomes of different individuals are tied very closely to the fortunes of the particular industries in which they make their living. Individuals employed or invested in export industries benefit from trade according to this model, while those who are attached to import competing industries are harmed. And so this kind of looks at that changing industries is really difficult. So it's less that we're going to see, an alliance or preferences coming from, are you a worker, a capital owner, or a landowner? It's going to be looking at how does your industry survive. So if you're in an industry that's a high demand, or that's an exporting industry, right, and does well from exporting, it doesn't matter whether you're the owner of the factory, the owner of the land, or one of the workers in that industry, you're doing well. So even if you're a laborer in Canada, but you're working in an industry that exports really well, even though from the Stouffer Samuelson perspective as a laborer, you shouldn't like trade, you're actually doing really well. But if you're a laborer or a landowner, say you're a landowner in an industry that's not doing exporting as well, or is competing with other importers in Canada, it doesn't matter if you're an owner of an abandoned factory in Canada, you're not going to be doing as well, and so you're not going to like trade as much. So it's more kind of alliances across the different factors within industries, depending on, is that industry an exporter or an import competing industry? And it's based on the idea that it's hard to change industry. So for laborers, if you're trained in one industry, it doesn't mean that overnight you could be trained in a new one. So even if you're, in a great exporting country for labor, and labor doing great as a factor of production, if you're in an industry that goes under, it's not like you're going to necessarily be able to get retrained immediately, and it could harm you. Same thing if you're an owner of a factory, right? It's very costly to transform a factory into producing something else. So if your industry goes under, even if you're in a country where owning capital is abundant, and so capital should be able to do well in terms of exporting. If you're in an industry that's import competing or is not exporting particularly well, then it's very costly for you to change, and so you don't want to be competing with other companies who are trying to export into your country. So you don't want to be import competing. And so all of this is based on, it's difficult to change industry. So you get an alliance less based on factors, but on industry type. And how well is that? Is it an exporting industry, in which case you like free trade, or is it an import competing industry, which are harmed by free trade and so won't like free trade as much? All right, so start with what exactly is money. So money provides a single medium against which all goods can be valued. Different buyers and different sellers place different values on goods, but all buyers and sellers place about the same value on money. So it serves as a standard against which other values can be measured, right? So rather than having to find someone to trade specific goods with, you can exchange money with them to buy goods. So if you have bread and you need apples, you don't have to find someone who's willing to exchange bread for apples. Instead, you can sell your bread for money, and you can use that money to buy apples. Money itself has little or no inherent value, right? So particularly if we're thinking about paper money, or even coins, paper money, right? Like a $20 bill is not, that piece of paper is not worth $20 in and of itself. What gives it value is the belief that it has value, so that it can be exchanged for goods, right? So we assign a certain value to that paper. Everyone commonly agrees on that value of that paper, and so it takes on that value. Because it depends on the willingness of people to honor and use it, money's value rests on trust. So governments have the job of creating money and of maintaining public confidence in its value. So if people stop believing that money can actually be exchanged for goods, or that its value is going to keep changing, so the amount that you get for selling your bread is going to keep differing, and so it's going to affect how many apples you can buy. Or if you start believing that all of a sudden that many people aren't going to accept money, then it ceases to have value. So money in international economics is slightly different. There's a slightly different dynamic than what we have in the domestic economy, because there's a different transactions that take place between individuals living in the same country and in different countries, that the latter requires people to convert one national currency into another, right? So if you're buying within Canada, you're buying and selling within Canada, you're always using Canadian dollars. But if, say, you want to be buying a good from the United States, you require US dollars to make that purchase. So you've got to be able to convert your Canadian dollars into US dollars to be able to have that transaction take place. And this isn't something that we have in the domestic economy. So we refer to the exchange rate as the rate at which one state's currency can be exchanged for currency of another state, right? So the exchange rate, say, between Canada and the US dollar, how many Canadian dollars does it take to buy one US dollar? How many Canadian dollars does it take to buy 1 pound or 1 euro or 1 yen? Most exchange rates are expressed in terms of the world's most important currencies, right? So if you go to an exchange bureau, you're not often going to see kind of the Canadian dollar expressed against many of the smaller world currencies. Instead, you'll see it vis-a-vis, say, the largest ones. And then if you need to get that smaller currency, you'll often then be able to, once you get to that country, buy it using the important world currency. So exchange rates that most affect the world economy are those within the largest economies. So ones like the US dollar, euro, yen, British pound, Canadian dollar. There's a few others. And so these are the ones that you see countries holding the most of. They're the ones that are most common in exchanges. The relative value of currencies at a given point in time are arbitrary. Only the change in value over time are meaningful. So if the Canadian dollar always had the same value vis-a-vis the United States, we'd be able to set up a predictable relationship where people could decide, okay, how much does it cost to buy things from the United States? How much does it cost to buy things from Canada? Do I want to buy it from the States, or do I want to buy it from Canada based on this amount? So really, at the end of the day, if it were stable, it doesn't really matter. But it's the change in values that are meaningful. It's when the Canadian dollar is going up vis-a-vis the US dollar, or going down. That's what becomes noteworthy. It's not really what the level is at any particular time, because if it were stable, we could just adjust to that. So the possibility of change in the values introduces risk into international economics, because it's something that's not predictable. And so that's a change in relative values. For example, nobody wants to hold currency that's rapidly inflating, so losing value relatively to goods and services. Inflation reduces a currency's value relative to more stable or more slowly inflating currencies. To say there's rapid inflation in a particular country, you don't want to be holding that currency. So if you were doing transactions with that country and you're getting their currency, well, that currency that you just got is less and less and less valuable. So it's not a currency that you want to be holding, for example. But because of the changes, you never quite know, which currencies to be holding. There's always risk when you do a transaction with another economy that, at one point the money that you get won't be worth the same amount when you sell, when you spend it. So for example, say you get a certain amount of US dollars in one transaction, and you're hoping that then you're going to be able to spend it, and in another transaction, and you're hoping that you're going to get kind of equivalent value back. You could get lucky, and in the time that you're holding the US dollar, that you actually get a better deal. But the currency could go in an opposite direction, and when you try to convert your US dollars back into Canadian dollars, you get a less favorable exchange rate and you lose money. So how do we manage exchange rates? Given that it introduces risk into the economy, we've come up with multiple different versions of kind of systems for managing, this risk. Prior to the First World War, we had what was called the gold standard, and almost all governments fixed the value of their currency in terms of gold, thereby creating an international monetary system in which all rates of conversion between individual currencies were held constant. So each currency was, had a certain exchange rate vis-a-vis gold, but that was fixed. So while each currency was worth a different amount, you always knew, what the US dollar would be worth, what the franc would be worth, what the pound would be worth. All of these different currencies, you knew their value vis-a-vis gold, and so it was a stable, or there's little foreign exchange risk. The Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates was introduced between the Second World War and 1973. And in this system, most currencies were fixed in value to the United States dollar, which was the most important currency in the post-Second World War. It was a currency of the most powerful or important currency in the world economy. In the system, often referred to as the Bretton Woods system, the US agreed to guarantee the value of the United States dollar against gold. So it was set at a price of $35 per ounce. So other countries, if they held United States dollars, and if they needed to, the US committed to, they could get exchange it for gold at a rate of $35 per ounce. So every currency was tied to the United States dollar, and the United States dollar was tied to gold. And so it was a fixed rate system. So the Canadian dollar always had a certain value vis-a-vis the United States dollar, and the British pound always had a certain value vis-a-vis the United States dollar. And because countries may not particularly have valued the United States dollar in itself, or necessarily trust the United States dollar, there's a conversion where you could trade in your US dollars for gold as kind of a security mechanism in the system. However, beginning in 1973, Dixon closed the gold window. So essentially, he abandoned the fixed rate between the dollar and gold. So he didn't say, hey, the US dollar is always going to be exchangeable for gold at the same rate. And so at that point, the system kind of collapsed, and all the major currencies have been allowed to float or fluctuate freely in value in world markets, right? So the Canadian dollar is not always doesn't always have the same value vis-a-vis the United States dollar or the euro or the pound. All of them are changing based on market demands for each currency. So higher demand or the supply and demand will both have effects on the prices. National governments periodically intervene in financial markets, buying and selling currencies in order to manipulate their value. Government intervention to manage the otherwise free-floating currency is called the managed float system, right? So it's not a fully floating system in that governments do sometimes intervene, and sometimes particularly the leading industrialized states often work together in some interventions. They don't always work together. It doesn't always work, but say, for example, a particular currency is kind of getting too far for what people want, or particularly in a free fall, then other countries may work together to try to prop up that currency. So they're going to put it at influence how much the market values it, or they're just going to act as a market actor themselves, and by buying or selling, they'll be able to affect the market price. But it's important to remember that even the strongest governments are at a major disadvantage when it comes to intervention. So it's something that should be kept to a minimum, or generally is kept to a minimum, because as big as governments are, even when we're talking about all the leading states working together, they're tiny compared to the market. They control only a fraction of the money being moved. Most of it is being moved by privately owned actors, right? So particularly when you're dealing with the bigger currencies, governments only control such a small portion that even if they all work together and all buy together or all sell together, it may still only have a small impact on the price of the currency because it's only a small change in volume of trade. This is something that they have more power to intervene when we're dealing with smaller currencies. Buying and selling on mass on smaller currencies where there's less of it being floating around in the private market can have a much larger impact. So let's return to, since we're in a flowing rate system, let's return to foreign exchange risk, which is instability in exchange rates disrupts business in trade-oriented sectors since companies might face sudden and unpredictable changes in their plans for income and expenses. So imagine you've got a company in our globalized economy that is buying parts from another country. If you had a fixed exchange rate system, they would always know, okay, this is the cost of that. Even if it's coming from a country that's got more expensive currency, if it's the best price, then it may still choose to buy from that, from a company in that country. But it knows each year the price is going to be, there may be slight inflation because prices go up often, but they know that, you know, if it's going to cost, you know, 100,000 US dollars, and say it's a Canadian company, they know they can buy 100,000 US dollars for X amount of Canadian dollars. And so the cost is the same each year, or at least the cost is just as predictable as it were if they were buying it from a Canadian company. But if you're in a floating exchange rate system and they're planning to buy, you know, from a supplier over multiple years, they don't know what the cost is going to be in the next year. So say their product is really requiring a particular input from another country. In one year, it may be relatively cheap, but in another year, they don't know with changes in exchange rates. They don't know if this input all of a sudden is going to become prohibitively expensive, or could it change drastically in value. I mean, the Canadian dollar has fluctuated vis-a-vis the United States dollar within the last 10 years quite substantially, from being just about parity, so just about one-to-one trading, at some point actually being briefly higher than the US dollar, to, you know, going down to about, what, 69 cents. So from 1-to-1 or 1.01 down to, you know, back down into the 60s is a fairly, if you set up your deal at the 1-to-1, or you set your plan at the 1-to-1 and then it falls that far, all of a sudden buying from the United States can add a substantial cost to your business. And that's all just in foreign exchange risk. It's not that companies change their prices. It's or technological changes or anything like that. It's just changes in currencies. So what can cause foreign exchange risk, or what could change, what could create volatility in foreign exchange, so in exchange rates? So in short term, it's speculation about the value of currencies, right? So currencies are traded in international markets, and people who buy and sell different currencies are making speculations about the value of the future currency. So they're going to buy ones that are currently, say, low and they expect to go up. They're going to sell those that are currently high and they expect to go down. So a lot of it's going to be about expectations about the future direction, the short-term, medium-term, future direction of the currency. And then in long-term changes, so that's short-term, where it can go up in one day and then go down the next day, or go up 1 month and then go down the next month. But longer-term ones can see kind of long-term patterns of, is it going to be declining vis-a-vis other currencies. It's going to move from one level and move systematically down to another level. So changes in long-term supply and demand for currency make long-term changes in foreign exchange. So supply is determined by the amount of money a government prints. Printing money is a quick way to generate revenue for the government, but the more money printed, the lower its price, right? So if the government starts just flooding the market with a whole bunch of money for whatever reason, because it needed it for domestic purposes, that's going to have a substantial, by just having that much more money floating around, it's going to have an impact long-term on the price, right? Because if all of a sudden you're going from, X amount of, say, Canadian dollars floating around, and so there's a price based on that amount floating around, to X plus 10 or 2X floating around. And that's going to, you're going to set a new price for the currency based on that supply. And then demand for currency depends on the state's economic health and political stability. So in general, people want to hold currencies in politically stable countries, right? Because you trust that the long-term value of that currency is going to be stable. So in terms of an investment, you're not going to lose money because of a downturn or because of a country collapse. It's going to hold to its obligations. And the state's economic health, right? Stronger, you want to hold usually currency in stronger economies because there's less volatility. So it's a more predictable asset to hold. So essentially, bearing in mind that foreign exchange risk causes a cost for economy or causes uncertainty for economy, governments have to keep this in mind when they choose their exchange rate system. So they have to decide whether to allow the currency to fluctuate in response to supply and demand, or whether to fix the currency to another currency. But this is actually a more complicated decision than some of the other ones we've talked about. So economists typically agree on the benefits of things like trade, immigration, and investment, right? So most economists will agree that open trade is good, that immigration is good, and that investment is good. So free flow investment is good. When it comes to exchange rate policy, it's more complex. And that's for, there's a simple trade-off. When it comes to kind of a floating system or versus fixed system, we have a trade-off, and we have two goods that we have to choose between. We have to choose between eliminating exchange rate risk, which is something we'd like to do. So in that case, we'd prefer a fixed exchange rate system because there's no exchange rate system. But in doing so, we would be sacrificing control over monetary policy. And control over monetary policy is also something that we like. So there's two things that we would like to have economically, and we can only have one of them. So that's where there's a debate as to which one's better. So fixing eliminates exchange rate risk. It makes international trade and investment less costly for firms and individuals, since they will not need to worry that the benefits from these international transactions will be adversely affected by some sudden unexpected shift in exchange rates. By doing away with exchange rate risk, fixing allows the economy to benefit more fully from international trade and investment, right? Because there's no risk, there's no uncertainty. A company doesn't have to be worried about participating in international trade and investment, so it can help to make it to increase the flow. And so that's great. That's something that obviously we would like. But fixing also diminishes control over monetary policy. A nation's monetary policy regulates the supply of money and the associated cost of credit in order to manage aggregate levels of economic activity and hence levels of inflation and unemployment. When a government commits to fixing the exchange rate, it effectively gives up the ability to tailor monetary policy to manage domestic economic conditions. So things like changing interest rates or changing the supply of money, all of these things are things that can control unemployment or inflation, which are definitely things in the domestic economy that we want to be able to take care of. But things like changing the domestic interest rate or changing the supply of money are also things that are going to change how much people want to hold our currency. So if you change those, you can't maintain that fixed price because there's going to be a disjoint. You're going to be saying that this is the price of the currency, but nobody's going to they're going to be wanting it way too much or not enough. So control over monetary policy would, if you maintain control of monetary policy and tried to have fixed exchange rates, you'd have a system that would be unstable. So if you want to have fixed exchange rates, then you have to maintain supplies of money and interest rates that allow for your currency to kind of sit where it's meant to sit, kind of its assigned value. Now, you may periodically be able to change that assigned value if there's too much pressure in a fixed system, but that should be kept to the minimum because it gives up kind of the whole benefit. So we've got do you want to be able to control things like, interest rate in our country, which is, changing the interest rate. For example, we've seen the Bank of Canada reduce the interest rate to try to get, money flowing to make the cost of credit lower, and to try to stimulate the economy with the downturn related to COVID-19. If we were in a fixed exchange rate system, it wouldn't have necessarily that ammunition to be able to fight the downturn. So we've got these two competing goods, and so it's essentially a decision between stability and policy control. And since the 1970s, since the closing of the gold window in 1973, most developed countries have tended to favor policy control, and less developed countries have tended to favor stability. This is partially because the choice for stability, when it comes to the smaller countries or less developed countries, the smaller the country, the more foreign exchange risk can affect them. Because with a smaller currency, even small changes in demand or supply can have huge effects on the economy. Where small change in supply and demand of a currency like the Canadian dollar or the US dollar, there's such a huge demand and supply of the currency that you're not going to see huge fluctuations. But in smaller countries, even a small sale, like a $1 billion sale of a small country's currency, right? Could be big compared to the total supply, where $1 billion sale of US dollars, say, would be tiny in terms of the supply of US dollars. And so $1 billion for that small currency could have a drastic change on its value, where a small $1 billion change in a sale in US dollars would have almost no effect on its price, or a very small effect on its price. So it's in a fixed floating exchange rate system, less developed countries would see much more instability than do larger countries. So there's a choice more for stability for them, where the larger countries have chosen more developed countries, larger economies have chosen largely to go with policy control. A stronger currency, just in general. So, how does exchange rates? So when you fix the value, or if it's floating but you have a stronger currency, that does have an effect on your country. Stronger currency will harm those in export-oriented and import-competing industries. So stronger currency, export, because it's expensive to buy that currency, it makes exports more expensive. Because you have a stronger currency, it's easier for consumers to buy from other countries. So it's easier for them to import. So if you're competing with imports, it's tougher. So, for example, Canada does so much trade with the United States, and the Canadian dollar is typically weaker than the US dollar. And so this has been something that's always helped our export industry and our import competing industry. But it's hurt consumers who like to import. So consumers who want to import have faced more expensive products. But because they face more expensive products from importing, Canadian industry that competes with American imports, they do better. And Canadian exporters do better because their products are less expensive than, say, American equivalents. So if you're an American consumer, you'd prefer the Canadian version, because even if they're priced kind of the same in their home currencies, because the US dollar is stronger than the Canadian dollar, they can buy more Canadian currency. So what are the institutions that make up kind of how do we manage monetary policy? And so at the end of World War II, we created a series of the Bretton Woods system, came with a few different institutions that are related to managing monetary policy. It was adopted at the Conference of the Winning States in 1944. So one of them was the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and it was a source of loans for reconstruction of Western European economies after the war and to help states through future financial difficulties. So essentially, after the war, most of the Western European economies were decimated, and so they needed kind of just a bank to get loans so that they could rebuild their economies and rebuild their countries. Eventually, the Western European states, you know, got back on their feet, and they didn't need loans for reconstruction because they were fully reconstructed. So the main borrowers became countries of the global south and in the 1990s, Eastern European states. So kind of the World Bank pivoted from reconstruction loans for reconstruction of Western Europe to more of loans for larger projects for development assistance in developing states. The International Monetary Fund coordinates international currency exchange, the balance of international payments, and national accounts. We'll talk more about national accounts and stuff like that soon. This is more of kind of a short-term supply of money. So not necessarily long-term loans for projects, but more about kind of short-term loans for stabilizing an economy. So the technical mechanism of the IMF are based on each member state's deposit of financial reserves with the IMF. So each state deposits financial reserves with the IMF. Upon joining, a state is assigned a quota for such deposits, partly of hard currency and partly a state's own currency. The quota is based on the size and strength of the state's economy. A state can then borrow against its quota, even exceeding it somewhat, to stabilize its economy in difficult times and repay the IMF in subsequent years. So if you've got a really, really short-term difficult time, you can take out some of the money that you've deposited with the IMF, and sometimes even actually extra, based on what others have deposited, and on the commitment that you'll repay certainly the extra that you borrowed, but also you'll repay and put back in the amount that you had stored there for kind of the next rainy day. So it can be bringing in an infusion of money for a government that, due to kind of short-term economic difficulties, requires an infusion. So how do we express state financial positions? How do we keep kind of each country's different ledger? So we talked about the IMF maintains a system of national accounts, so kind of keeps record of how money coming in and money going out to see is a country losing money or gaining money. So the IMF maintains a system of national account statistics to keep track of the overall monetary position of each state. State's balance of payments is like the financial statement of a company, summarize all the flows of money into and out of the country, just like how a company would show all kind of the expenses and revenue, so everything coming in and everything going out. Essentially, three types of transactions go into the balance of payments. So we've got the current account, flows of capital, and changes in reserves. So let's look at each of them. So the current account is the balance of trade. So we talked a little bit about the current account last time. Money flows out of a state to pay for imports and flows into a state to pay for exports. Imported and exported include merchandise and services. So each time you want to buy something, you're kind of needing somebody who is willing to accept kind of Canadian dollars for US dollars. And so you buy a certain amount. So money flows out of a state to pay for imports, right? So we're giving it to somebody else and saying, here, take my Canadian dollars. Or to a foreign exchange, we're giving it to a bank and saying, take my Canadian dollar, give me some American dollars that I can give to this American producer. So money's leaving the country, and it flows into the state for exports. Capital flows, foreign investments in and by a country. So capital flows are measured in net terms. So the total investments and loans foreigners make in a country minus the investments and loans that a country's companies, citizens, and governments invest in other countries. So there's two forms of kind of capital flows that we look at. So we look at foreign direct investment, such as building a factory, owning a company, or buying real estate in a foreign country. And then portfolio investment, so buying stocks and bonds or making loans to a foreign country. So foreign direct investment would be, you're buying up part of that country's wealth in the terms of, actually owning a company, real estate, so owning a building, building a factory, buying a company, and so you own it. So the proceeds from that would often return. So yes, say you own a company, you'd pay the salaries, but the profit would come back to your country. Or just portfolio investment. So if you don't want to buy, if you can't buy entire real estate, but you could still invest in stocks and bonds, or make loans to a foreign company. So if you participate in, say, the American stock market and you're buying shares in a US company, that could be part of an American portfolio investment, and that would count as a kind of a capital flow. So it would be a foreign investment. And then changes in foreign exchange reserves. So balance and payments in national, so this balances the payments in national accounts. Any difference between the inflow and outflow of money in either the current account or capital flows combined is made up by an equal but opposite change in reserve. So countries often hold reserves of other currencies and hold reserves kind of their own currencies, but also, so Canada would hold a certain reserve of US dollars and pounds and euros, particularly of the strongest currencies. And so if you've got, if you're losing money in terms of investments and trade, or if the amount of capital flow coming in is less than the your kind of trade imbalance, then you've got to make up for that by giving up some of the money. If you're losing money on net from these two, somehow you've got to balance that, right? Because otherwise you'd be owing people stuff. So you've got to balance that. And the way that can be done is by drawing down foreign exchange reserves. So how much extra currency, particularly of other currencies that you hold. So if you owe the US because of a trade deficit with the US, well, then you've got to make some of that up by releasing US dollars. So say you've got a trade deficit and you're not able to attract enough foreign investment, so you're not able to, to fund that by we've got trade deficits, say, with the US, and we're not able to get enough American investment to gain the currency to fund that. Well, then we're also going to have to give up some of our foreign exchange reserves, some of the US dollars that we hold. Because at the end of the day, our national accounts have to balance. You've got to have the same amount of money coming in and out. Over the short term, you may be able to have imbalances in terms of debt or stuff like that, but eventually that's all got to be settled. So let's talk about international debt. So if the state's economy is healthy, it can borrow money from foreign governments, banks, or companies and create enough new wealth to repay the debts for a few years later, right? Because countries often get really good interest rates, so they can take on a loan, and the idea is that they can invest that money. For example, so the governments or just companies can take out loans, but let's just think of like the country can take out loans, put those loans into building new companies or in improving the economy, so that those economies then create additional wealth, and they can use that additional wealth to pay back the loan. So they can still actually use the loan, take on a small amount of debt, use that to improve things, and essentially pay it off and come out in the long term in a better position. The problem is that states, like businesses, sometimes operate at a loss and their debts mount up. So if the money that you invest from the debt, or the money that you use from the debt, can produce productive assets that allow you to pay back the loan fairly quickly, and then once the loan's paid off, continue to operate. Say you could pay off the loan just from the profits, then you've got an economy that's doing well, and then once you paid off that debt, the profits can go into reinvestment in the economy. and so you haven't taken a loss. But say the money that you invest, the loan you invested in building a new company, and that company continues to take a loss. Well, then you're having to take out new loans to pay off the old loans, but also to try and creating new companies. And so you can end up in a vicious cycle where more and more of you're having to take out more and more loans, and you're having to spend more and more of the economy on kind of like the economic resources of the country on paying that loan. So say the government owes a lot of money to other governments, rather than putting the government revenue into services for the public, they have to be putting it into debt service. And so you have some countries that every country takes out loans, and sometimes, and most countries, hold a decent amount of debt. But in a lot of countries, in healthier countries, or healthier at least ones for debt, it's an amount of debt that they could pay off, and it's not one that leads to concerns about the health of the economy. And we're managing the debt, so managing kind of the interest payments or the debt payments is something that's manageable based on the size of the economy. Where you get into a bigger problem is when that debt load just starts getting higher and higher and higher. So just servicing the debt takes up more and more of the economy, which leaves less to be put towards new investments or towards the people. So more and more in a vicious cycle, more and more of the income generated might go to paying interest, and more money must be borrowed to keep the state in operation, right? So because you have to spend the money on paying the interest, you don't have money to run the economy, so then you have to take out a loan, and then you've got to use the state revenues to pay now both interest, and then to run the economy, you've got to take another loan, and so it could become a problem. When a state's debts accumulate, its standing wealth is diminished as assets are sold off to pay for the debts, right? So one way of paying off the debts, if you don't want to say be using revenue, is to be selling off assets. So it could be selling off, companies or land or stuff like that to others. So these are parts of, what could be the country's wealth that they could be used to, fund the economy, are now owned by foreign companies. So, the good part is they might run the company and people could get income, but the profits are going to leave the company, or are going to leave the country. Failure to repay debts makes it hard to borrow in the future, a huge impediment to economic growth. This is particularly true for smaller economies. In the 1970s and 1980s, debts accumulated in some countries in the global south to the point of virtual national bankruptcy. The debts became unpayable, and the lenders, banks, and governments were forced to write them off the books or sell them at a fraction of their official value. So that's a particularly big problem. So big economies can get high levels of debt, and certainly there's even some European countries with very noteworthy debt levels, which can cause severe financial difficulties. But the biggest problems that we often see are in the developing countries, where there's been campaigns to kind of settle the debt or kind of forgive the debt, because the developing countries owe so much money that they're spending so much of their money on debt service that they just never have a chance to develop. They're so stuck in that vicious cycle that even if they manage to find new revenues, all those new revenues don't get reinvested into development. It gets invested into paying off their debts. Industrialized states rarely face such a drastic situation, but any national debt still represents a mercantilist loss of power. So what I talked about, national debt. So it's opposite of pile of resources. So instead of having the reserves that you could spend for military, you actually owe, and so somebody else has an excess. Massive bailouts to the banks in 2009 recession resulted in a significant accumulation of debt among industrial countries. So it's not to say that debt is just a developing country problem. In 2011, Britain, Spain, and the United States, Ireland, Portugal, Italy, and numerous other states had accumulated debt that exceeded 60% of their annual GDP. So more than 60% of what they make in a year, the country makes in a year, is actually the debt is larger than 60% of that. So imagine if you had a country that the entire economy, so not just government revenue, but the entire economy produced X amount. You would have to spend 60% of that if you want to pay off your whole debt in 1 year. Now, no country pays off their debt in whole 1 year, but it's still showing how massive these debts can be. And we do tend to see, just in terms of trends, we see higher debt levels in recessions because governments are making less and spending more to try to stimulate the economy. And then you see gradually, often the debt loads decrease as times get better. A, countries are making more, but B, they don't have to spend as much in stimulating the economy, so they can pay down their debt load. Some of the more problematic countries, there's been a lot of talk, or there's been some high concern in the U.S. over their debt, that even in the good years, that debt load just seems to be going up and up and up, that they're not managing they're spending high amounts in the bad years to try to overcome it, but they're not cutting spending in the good years, so the debt continues to go up. Other ones, so Spain, Italy, Greece, even before 2011 had extremely high debt loads. So reasons for debt, so it could be trade deficits, overconsumption by households and businesses, and government spending greater than taxation. So, in financial, in recessions, we see a lot of the government spending greater than taxation income, because A, as people are making less, taxation income goes down. B, governments have to spend to overcome it. In some countries, in Canada, overconsumption by households and businesses is definitely a concern. Canadians are among the worst in holding, Canadian government isn't one of the worst in terms of holding debt, but Canadian as individuals actually are among some of the worst in holding excessive amounts of personal debt, particularly things like credit card debt, which is a vulnerability definitely for the economy as a whole. And here's the 20 countries with the highest public debt in 2017 in relation to the gross domestic product. So if we look at like Japan, which is certainly an outlier at the high end, their national debt is about 249% of their gross domestic product. So if they spent every single cent that they made in the entire economy in a year, it'd take 2.5 years. So forget about anybody buying any food, anything. If they spent everything produced in that economy for 2.5 years, it would take 2.5 years to pay off their debt. And you've got Greece, which is a notoriously high one as well. And then it goes along with some of the highest ones. Canada is not on this list of the highest ones. Canada's national debt has typically, over the last decades, been kept in obviously there still is some. Most countries still hold some debt. There's these loans, again, if you can spend them for productive purposes, can actually be useful. Same thing as personal loans or credit, right? If you had to think about buying a house, if you had to wait until you had the whole money to buy the house, nobody would ever buy a house. So we need the credit system, and buying a house is an excellent asset to have in long term. So buying houses is great, as long as you stick to not an excessive amount of debt, and debt that can be used productively, so you don't get into a vicious cycle where you're spending too much of your personal income or national income paying off the debt.